Inference Plus Story Short number 32, Series B. The tiny village of Hlupak was home to an excellent cobbler, one pub, a seasonal vegetable market, and a quantity of exceedingly stupid men. It is easy to confuse a lack of formal education with stupidity, but they are not, in fact, the same. A person lacking informal education can still be quite intelligent, having the capacity to learn through observation. A stupid person lacks the ability to observe, and therefore stumbles through life reliant upon divine grace or simple good fortune. The men of Hlupak were, by this definition, indeed supremely stupid, none more so than Pavel and Velki. Pavel was a thick man with thick arms, a thick beard, and a thick neck. Between sessions spent warming his favorite seat at the pub, he engaged in occasional work for hire, cutting just enough firewood or catching just enough fish to pay for his next round of slivets. He made his bed in whatever hayloft he was offered for the night, ate whatever bread was left discarded on the rubbish heap, and always smelled vaguely of cabbage. In a larger town, he would have been the sort of drifter who passed through life unknown and unnoticed, but within the smallness of Hlupak, his presence was acknowledged and accepted, if not entirely adored. Velki was Pavel's opposite in many ways. He was a small man with slender arms, a slender neck, and a sparse beard, like that of a boy, rather than a grown man of 36. Like Pavel, he worked just enough to quench his thirst, slept wherever he happened upon an unguarded pile of straw, and carried with him a vague whiff of cabbage. Also like Velki, he was noted by the townsfolk, but was not the sort of person one invited for Sunday supper. And this suited him fine, since he preferred the pub anyway. Perhaps due to competition for the easiest work, or perhaps because of some now-forgotten slight, there existed between the two men a long-standing, if nonsensical, rivalry. Had their temperaments not been so similar, the chafing between them might have been blamed on a difference in personality. As it stood, perhaps it was the sameness between them that rankled, not unlike a dog, which, upon seeing its reflection in a pool of water, attacks, only to find itself taking an unexpected swim. They often exchanged words, bickering about topics as innocuous as the weather, or as loaded as taxes, with equal venom. The greatest and most frequent source of disharmony was the question of which man possessed greater strength and vigor. After a few bottles of wine, they would begin to bicker, and inevitably would end the night brawling in the alley while the townsfolk placed bets on who would win the evening's sparring. Generally, the more drunken man was the surer bet for winner, but there were enough surprises with regard to the outcome to keep the spectacle interesting, no matter how many times it occurred. One winter night, when the temperature was too cold for an outdoor brawl, no matter how much slivets had been consumed, matters came to a head. The disagreement this time was about which of the men was hardier. "I'm twice your size," Pavel laughed, spitting on the floor precariously close to Velki's boot. "A wolfhound is twice the size of a dachshund, but a dachshund will outlive a wolfhound by 8 years at least," Velki replied, as he clenched and unclenched his tiny fists. "And you know as well as I that I can hold my liquor far better than you." "I'll drink you under the table," Pavel raged. "You'll die trying," Velki replied. "Why don't we settle the question of who is hardier once and for all?" Pavel said. "We will compete in a contest of strength and will, and then it will be settled. And you will know that I'm the better man." "I'm in agreement on all but the final part," Velki said. "Let us shake hands to seal the bet." "You must decide the terms first," Vaclav, the barman, said. "Indeed, we must," Velki agreed grudgingly. "Here is what I propose. Starting now, we fast for 12 hours. Our stomachs must be entirely empty of all other food and drink before we begin, lest one of us gain an unfair advantage." Pavel nodded. So far, they were in accord. "In 12 hours' time, we will each consume 6 bottles of wine, after which time we will commence a foot race from here to Daleko. Whoever arrives there first will have been proven, once and for all, the better and hardier man. Do you agree to these terms?" "I agree." "Then we begin on the morrow." The other men in the pub were far from learned, but even they could see the folly of this endeavor. Still, none objected. For one thing, it was pointless to argue with fools. For another, this was likely to be the best entertainment all winter, and it would be a shame to extinguish the blaze of their anger with good sense. At the appointed time, both Pavel and Velky arrived at the pub, ready for competition. Vaclav the barkeep could only shake his head with annoyance that, for the first time in their lives, the two idiots had seen fit to follow through on a plan. Word is quick to travel through a small village, and a crowd had gathered to partake in the festivities, or at the very least to ogle at the disaster, the way one might stop to watch the outcome of a runaway cart. Vaclav paced the bottles of wine on the table before the two men, but hesitated a moment before leaving them to their fates. He felt a tug of conscience, and he would attempt to assuage it. "Are you certain this contest is necessary?" Vaclav asked, looking back and forth between the men before him. "It may be better to enjoy a few cups of wine and agree that each of you are equally stupid." "Never!" Pavel cried. "Absolutely not!" Velky shouted. Vaclav raised his palms and sighed. The attempt had been made. He returned to his place behind the bar. "Prepare to lose, dachshund," Pavel snorted. "To the likes of a lumbering wolfhound like you, unlikely," Velky replied. They wasted no time in consuming the wine. Within 2 hours, all 12 bottles sat empty on the table. Both Pavel and Velky had begun to slide down in their chairs, stomachs bloated and eyes little more than slits. Vaclav, relieved, wiped his hands on his apron. It appeared that the problem had resolved itself. Appearances can be deceiving. Pavel was the first to stagger to his feet. Swaying in a sort of uneasy waltz, he made his way unsteadily towards the door. He turned to Velky. "Are you man enough, or do you concede?" he slurred. "Why would I concede?" Velky slurred in reply. "Unless, of course, this is a sad attempt to salvage your honor by avoiding the race." "Quite the opposite," Pavel retorted. "In fact, I'd like to raise the stakes of our wager. One measure of a man's hardiness is his ability to withstand the cold. We should therefore run the race to Delego bare-chested. Unless, of course, you're not man enough." Velky's agreement to the terms was immediate, as he flung the layers of shirts and sweaters to the floor of the pub with a flourish. Pavel did the same, and they stood there in a shirtless face-off at the center of the pub. Once again, Vaclav the barman felt a niggling at the edges of his conscience. Before him stood two mutton-heads, highly inebriated, half-naked, in the bitterest of winter cold, about to undertake a foot race, having taken in no sustenance for half a day. Vaclav looked at the eager faces of the townspeople with imploring eyes. Would no one step in as a voice of reason? Apparently, once again, it was left to him to attempt to prevent certain calamity. "Stop!" Vaclav shouted, stepping between them. "This is folly. Think of what you're doing." "The only folly would be assuming that Pavel is hardier than me," Velky sneered, as he pushed the barkeep aside. Vaclav knew well the utter pointlessness of arguing with a deeply intoxicated man. He'd done what he could, and that was what he would tell the Lord himself on Judgment Day. Thanks to the quantity of strong wine they had consumed, neither man seemed to note the icy blast of air that blew through the door as they exited to the square. Velky, disinhibited by the drink, beat at his chest and howled like a wolf. Pavel, appearing a bit confused, as if he'd walked into a room and forgotten why he'd come there, lurched forward with the determination of a man who has no idea what he plans to do, but remains intent on doing it with gusto. It was Pavel who spoke next. "I feel no cold," he cried. "I am warm as a loaf of chelba fresh from the oven. See, I need no clothes at all, none." And with that, he removed his pants and his underclothes, and stood there completely nude, except for his worn boots and a pair of mismatched woolen socks. The crowd gasped. Mothers covered the eyes of their gawking children. Jamie and Mary, who had brought along their goat Jerry, covered the beast's eyes. The local prostitutes appeared unimpressed. I, too, feel no cold, Velky shouted before he, too, scrambled to remove everything but his socks and boots. Drunken and panting, they regarded one another, then began to run down the road that led to Delako, the villagers following behind as though the two naked drunkards were the grand marshals of a parade. The distance between the two towns was several kilometers, and after the first hour the novelty of watching the men's genitals flopping comically in the frigid air had worn off. So too had the crowd's amusement. The reality of the danger of the undertaking had sobered them, and many of the spectators now pleaded with the increasingly blue-tinged racers to accept a blanket or jacket, to return to the pub and put an end to this foolishness before they both caught their deaths. The pleas fell upon deaf ears as the foot race became a death march. It began to snow. "Do you concede, Dachshund?" Pavel chattered. "No," Velky shivered. "I will beat you." The wind shrieked as the snow began to obscure the road. The men staggered blindly on. The lights of Delako were just visible in the distance when Pavel and Velky collapsed into adjacent snowdrifts, dead before the blanket of snow had even covered them. In the end, it was determined that both men were equally hardy and equally stupid.